This is a meditation for Good Friday. Christ has died. That's where we are at this point in our journey through Holy Week. Christ has died, and it's hard to make sense of it all. We want to skip ahead to Easter Sunday and shout for joy with the news of the resurrection, but that is not where we are right now. Many of us want to pass quickly through the news of this terrible night to get to the happy conclusion, just as some of us want to pass quickly through the news of this terrible pandemic and get to the happy conclusion. And many of us just can't get past the point of Good Friday. Some of us never get to Easter Sunday because for us, life stops at Good Friday. Christ has died. Hope has ended. If we are paying attention at all to the news of the world around us, then it is hard for us to move on. It is important for us to pause at this point in our journey through Holy Week because most of us arrive at this point sooner or later in our lives. Most of us arrive at a point where we have no answer for the news of the world around us or for the tragedies we face. And I think it's better to stop and pause and ponder the unfathomable rather than to rush on willfully ignoring the unanswerable questions. We have learned to ignore the homeless woman uttering curses on the sidewalk. We skip past the stories in the news about refugees fleeing from famine or genocide, only to be trapped indefinitely in deportation camps. We do not know how to respond to stories about poverty in our own country. As a nation, we cannot come to a consensus about immigration or health care for all people. We struggle over the consequences of systemic racism and sexual exploitation deeply embedded in our culture. There are people in our own day who are, in Isaiah's words, the prophet Isaiah's words, despised and rejected. Those from whom others hide their faces, those whom the world holds of no account. In the prophet Isaiah's time, these people were assumed to be guilty of some crime and were therefore to blame for their own plight. Even today, we might believe that those who suffer do so because of their own actions, by refusing to take responsibility for their lives. With the news around us and the world around us so hard to take, sometimes we allow the suffering of others to brush by us until it ceases to disturb us. We are outraged at injustice less frequently. We become jaded and cynical. The prophet Isaiah reminds us that the suffering servant is the very one to whom God turns God's attention. God does not turn away from the one who suffers. In fact, the rejected, the afflicted, the oppressed are those whom God especially loves. Those who have been rejected by everyone else are the ones whom God exalts. The suffering servant in the passage from Isaiah is read by Christians around the world and from all times as a foretelling of Christ on the cross. The servant suffers vicariously in order to redeem the whole world. Now, it is likely that the prophet Isaiah wrote about the suffering servant several hundred years before Jesus to explain that the suffering of the whole nation of Israel was a means by which all of humanity might be redeemed. But we cannot read this passage without thinking about the image of Christ on the cross. He was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. By his bruises we are healed. In ancient times, there was a widespread practice of scapegoating, which allowed the deserved punishment for the sins of many people to fall on a single victim. As Isaiah said, the Lord has laid upon him the iniquity of us all. In the practice of ancient Israel, the high priest would lay his hands on a sacrificial goat to transfer on it the sins of all the people. Then the goat would be sent out into the wilderness so that the sins of the community would be carried away when the goat died. While scapegoating might be an obsolete as a religious practice, today it is very much alive as an informal practice in nearly every culture Immigrants, refugees, the young, the elderly, the poor, and the infirm all get burdened with the reluctance of others to shoulder the responsibilities for the problems that afflict us all. We lay upon a few people the sins of many people in order to absolve us all of the responsibility for wrongdoing. The modern sacrifices of new scapegoats lead to new crucifixions of innocent victims. Isaiah's song of the suffering servant and Jesus' own death on the cross are abiding reminders of the lengths to which we can go to destroy others and to deny God. The song of the suffering servant is our prayer of confession on Good Friday. The song of the suffering servant also reminds us of the lengths to which God will go to save us. God will suffer for us, will die on a cross for us, and will go through evil for us, descending even, in the words of the Apostles' Creed, into hell for us. God enters so deeply into the human experience that God, in Jesus, experiences even the absence of God. God reaches the point where life stops and questions cannot be answered. And then God dies in solidarity with the whole human condition. God joins in the human experience of God-forsakenness. The song of the suffering servant reminds us that Jesus breaks the cycle of scapegoating and sacrifice forever. Christ's sacrifice puts an end to victimizing innocents for our sake. Christ's sacrifice on the cross inaugurates a new justice that does not elevate one group at the expense of another. Christ has died. Sacrifice has ended. Christ has fully bridged the chasm between God and humanity. As we recall the song of the suffering servant and retell the story of Christ's passion, let us take up the challenge to join God's work to cease all victimhood, put an end to all scapegoating, and take our part in God's mission to redeem all creation.